As she made dinner, memories of that night filled her mind. He walked into the kitchen, and though she had gotten used to his quietness lately, he seemed different this time. There was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite understand. And then, in a moment, he was gone. She looked everywhere for him, calling his name, but he wasn't there. Standing by the window, Cynthia Sandner, 44, kept her eyes on the street outside. Her husband, Latham, had left so suddenly, and even though it had only been a few days, it felt like forever. She was left with nothing but unanswered questions and broken dreams. Latham had vanished without a word, leaving a mess of confusion behind. What went wrong, she wondered. Since Latham left, Cynthia had been on an emotional roller coaster, struggling with pain and heartbreak, as her life seemed to fall apart. After 5 years of marriage, she had hoped he would help her heal from past wounds, but now, once again, she was alone, just like when her last husband had left. Sitting on her bed, Cynthia held a small envelope in her hands, a painful reminder of the past she had tried so hard to forget. Latham's sudden departure left her to pick up the pieces alone. Could she handle this by herself? Then came another shock. Her daughter, Evie, told her she was pregnant. Just when Cynthia thought things couldn't get any worse, this news hit hard. Her heart sank. She had always tried to protect her daughter from life's harsh realities, but now, everything seemed to be crumbling around her. In the midst of dealing with the collapse of her marriage, Cynthia faced another blow. Her teenage daughter Evie was pregnant. The news was devastating, but Cynthia knew she had to stand by her daughter. Mark, 17, Evie's boyfriend, was the father. It felt like Cynthia was drowning in her own personal problems. To make things worse, Evie had chosen someone like Mark to father her child. The shock was overwhelming for Cynthia. Why would Evie behave so recklessly at such a young age? How could she have gotten involved with someone like Mark, betraying her mother's trust in the process? Cynthia felt crushed under the weight of the truth. 5 years later, she knew their lives would be difficult, but she had tried to provide her daughter with stability. Mark had become a regular presence in their home. As Evie's teenage boyfriend, he had been there for her through the dark times after Latham's departure, comforting her on nights when Cynthia cried herself to sleep. Though Mark was a good kid, he wasn't ready for the role of a father. Cynthia knew he needed to step up, so she had a serious talk with him. "Mark, you have to take responsibility for this baby. You can't just walk away," she said gently. Mark nodded, but Cynthia could see the fear in his eyes. He was just a boy facing adult responsibilities. Despite her disappointment, Cynthia realized she needed to support her daughter. She agreed to let Evie and Mark marry, hoping it would give them a fresh start. She wanted Evie to have a chance at a stable life. Over the next months, Mark did his best. He went to doctor's appointments, got a job, and prepared for the baby. Yet Cynthia saw the weight on him. He was still just a teenager, and the demands of fatherhood were already exhausting him. She wondered if he'd make it to the delivery day, as the pressure continued to mount. As the due date approached, Cynthia couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. She was paying for everything since Mark's parents wanted nothing to do with him. She knew her daughter wasn't ready to be a mother, and she feared for the future of her grandson. Still, she tried to remain positive, hoping that everything would work out in the end. But as the months passed, Cynthia couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. She noticed that Evie and Mark were constantly arguing, and Evie seemed to be growing more distant. Whenever Cynthia tried to talk to her daughter, Evie would brush her off, insisting that everything was fine. Finally, the day arrived. Evie went into labor, and Mark was by her side every step of the way. He held her hand and whispered words of encouragement as she pushed through the pain. When the baby was born, Mark's face lit up with joy. He held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his face. It was a joyous moment, considering the turmoil of the last 9 months. Cynthia, now a doting grandmother, was happy that her daughter and the baby were healthy. As Cynthia looked at her grandson, she couldn't shake the feeling something was off. Though he had dark hair and olive skin like Mark, his eyes seemed familiar. She brushed it aside and let the new parents enjoy their baby. As Nathan grew, the couple's relationship frayed. Mark was rarely home, leaving Cynthia with a broken heart and dreams of a perfect family shattered once again. One day, Cynthia walked in to see Evie crying with Nathan in her arms. Without a word, she realized Mark wasn't the baby's father. He had just been part of Evie's cover-up. Cynthia felt betrayed and furious, and her relationship with Evie grew more strained. Yet, she couldn't abandon her grandson. Despite Evie's neglect, Cynthia stepped in, vowing to give Nathan the care he deserved, even if it meant sacrificing her bond with her daughter. Baby Nathan was now 6 months old and growing into a handsome little boy, but Cynthia was finding it harder to keep caring for him. One day, as she held a small envelope in her hands, a surge of anger rose within her. She knew what she had to do. She had to confront Mark, to make him take responsibility for his actions and the pain he had caused her and Evie. He couldn't just walk away. He couldn't leave them behind. Cynthia was just about to head out when she saw baby Nathan eating a piece of apple. It wasn't the apple that caught her attention though, it was the way he ate it. As she walked toward the door, a realization washed over her, a devastating connection between her failed marriage and her grandson. She saw the resemblance. the familiar look in his eyes, the same look that had haunted her for years. It clicked, like a puzzle piece falling into place. Her grandson looked a lot like Latham, her ex-husband. Cynthia felt the world spinning around her, a whirlwind of emotions crashing over her like a tidal wave. She had been so consumed by her own pain, anger, and resentment that she had failed to see the truth staring her in the face. Latham had been the father of her daughter's baby all along. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. She remembered a conversation she had had with Latham all those years ago, a conversation that had ended in tears and heartache. And in that moment, she realized that Mark was not the father of her grandson, it was Latham. At that moment, Mark arrived at the house. Cynthia felt like her world was crumbling around her. She had been through so much already, and now this. How could she ever forgive Latham for what he had done to her, to their family? And how could she look at her grandson without feeling the pain of betrayal? She turned to Mark, her eyes filled with tears. "Mark, I need you to leave. I need some time to process everything that's happened." Mark nodded, his own eyes filled with sadness. He kissed Evie on the forehead and whispered words of love and support before leaving the room. As Cynthia watched him go, she knew she would never be the same again. For the next few days, Cynthia was lost in a haze of confusion and despair. She couldn't eat or sleep, and she couldn't even bring herself to look at her grandson. But slowly, she began to come to terms with the truth. Evie refused to talk to her, out of embarrassment. Cynthia couldn't get through to her daughter. She realized that she couldn't blame Mark for what had happened. He was just a boy after all, and he had done his best to support Evie through her pregnancy. But how could he have been okay with what Evie had done to him? Cynthia's pride turned to anguish, her anger to despair. She had been so blind, so naive, so desperate to hold on to the belief that Latham was a good man, a faithful husband, that she had failed to see the truth. Yes, Latham had left her, but he had left her with a parting gift, a reminder of the love they had shared, a piece of him that would live on forever. Cynthia fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face, a broken sob escaping her lips. She had been so wrong, so misguided, so foolish. She had been so focused on her own pain, her own anger and resentment, that she had failed to see the truth staring her right in the face. Latham had been the father of her daughter's baby all along. As the weeks passed, Cynthia found herself growing closer to her grandson. She spent hours playing with him, laughing as he smiled up at her. And with each passing day, a little more of the pain and anger melted away. But as she watched her grandson grow, she couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would Latham ever come back? And if he did, how could she ever forgive him for what he had done? Cynthia set her thoughts aside, focusing on her grandson. Holding him close, she promised to protect him and give him the happy life he deserved. As the day ended, she looked out the window with a peaceful smile, ready to be his support, no matter what the future held. But heartbreak soon followed. She tried to speak to her mother, but was met with silence. The awful truth hit her. Latham had been the father of her daughter's baby. Now he was gone, leaving behind betrayal and regret. Cynthia lay on the floor, overwhelmed, realizing that sometimes those we love the most hurt us the deepest, and sometimes all we can do is pick up the pieces and move forward.